I hardly know where to begin my story, but perhaps I might start with a little tale of an air fight, because a night or two ago I happened to be in the streets when German airships raided London, and I could not help recalling the difficulty of hitting even a huge object, like a zeppelin, in the night-time. In the early days of September 1914, when we had got used to fighting, the battalion was on the march when a German aeroplane, decorated with 2 iron crosses, was sighted. At that time we were more than 1,000 strong, and the lot of us opened fire with our rifles, rattling away with rapid fire, so that we soon accounted for about 15,000 rounds. At the same time, another battalion not far away was on the job, so that a perfect fusillade was going on. The firing was tremendous, but it seemed as if the machine would not be touched. At last, however, the aeroplane was brought down, the observer being dead and the other man severely burnt and wounded. I do not know whether it was our battalion or the other which got the machine, but I called to mind the great difficulty of hitting an aircraft when I watched the raid on London. I was walking along, too pleasantly occupied to be thinking of war, and did not know of the affair until I reached a street corner and saw the people craning their necks skywards, watching the airship and the shells that were bursting under it. Mons, Cambrai, the Marne, and the like make an old story by this time, so I will get on to the tale of my 9 months' captivity in Germany as a prisoner of war. It is common knowledge now that the Germans never lost a chance of trying to do something by treachery and trickery, and not playing the game. Killed and wounded English soldiers were robbed of their coats by the Germans, who took them for their own use, and dressed in these coats the enemy on several occasions tried to get near us, to their heavy cost, when we got accustomed to the dodge. One day, early in September, not long after we had gone out with the expeditionary force, a German machine-gun brigade came along dressed in our uniform. We thought they were reinforcements, so we let them get very close, and they occupied a ridge on our left. 10 minutes afterwards they opened fire on us, but our garrison artillery soon shifted them with 60-pounders. The Germans killed a lot of the Coldstreams that day by this trick. It was not long after this that we had one of those experiences which have been so often known in this great war. We were marching along in brigade column, with the Black Watch or Coldstreams, I am not sure which, leading. We were going through an area which had been reported all clear, and had got to a bend in the road when the Germans started shelling us. It was one of those swift happenings which cannot be avoided in such a war as this, and before we fully realized what was taking place, a shell had burst and killed 4 stretcher-bearers of the Coldstreams, the NCOI, who was in charge, and a wounded man who was being carried on a stretcher, and the same shell wounded a man in our front section of 4s. That one shell did a fair lot of havoc, and it was quickly followed by several more, but these did not do much mischief. What struck me most in this little affair was the coolness of our CEU, Colonel Lowther, now a brigadier general. He personally conducted every company from the left of the road into a ditch on the right of the road. "Keep cool, men," he said, "and come this way." And we did keep cool, for the colonel took the direction of everything, in spite of the shelling, just as calmly as if he was carrying out a battalion parade at home, a really wonderful performance at a time like that, and one which completely steadied the lot of us, though we had got pretty well used to things. But the Germans did not have a look in for long, for the Kilties got hold of the gunners and chased them off. I did not see much of it except in the distance, but we heard the shouting as the Jocks got to work with their bayonets. As we were going along the road, we saw where the Germans had put out of action a whole battery of our artillery, which was standing at the side of the road. The weather was dull, and it started to drizzle, so that it was not easy to distinguish troops. While the battery was being knocked out, some of our fellows, the loyal North Lancashire, I think, were advancing across a field. To protect themselves from the rain, they had covered themselves with their waterproof sheets. Seeing them and not being able to tell who they were, but believing them to be Germans, our gunners opened fire on them. But what damage they did I don't know. That was another of those things that will happen in war, and it could hardly be helped, for about this time it was a common dodge of the Germans to disguise themselves in British uniforms and attack us before we could tumble to the trick. When we had crossed the Aisne and had got into the hills, we had grown wary, and in crossing fields and open spaces we went in artillery formation, or blobbing, as it is called. This blobbing was a splendid way of saving the lives of men when we were under fire, for it kept us in platoons closed, but 200 yards between each platoon, and so enabled us to escape a good many of the bursting shells. We went along a whole stretch of country till we reached a small village and billeted there. In the morning we were on the move again, driving the Germans from one crest to another, but their position was too strong for us to shift them any farther, and it was a long, monotonous job of hanging on and waiting. They are practically in the same place now. We did a lot of bayonet work from time to time, but I can't say much about it. I know that in one affair I saw a German. I stuck, and he stuck, and he stuck, and I don't remember any more. One goes insane. I got a bang on the back of the head from somebody, though I thought at the time that a stone had been thrown and had struck me. I remember that day well, September 14th, because in addition to the charge, I saw a Jack Johnson for the first time, though we christened them Black Marias and coal boxes then. This monster burst amongst some French Algerian troops and shot a lot of them up into the air, literally blowing the poor devils to pieces. On October 19th, we marched away and moved by train, finally getting to Ypres. We dug trenches in a ditch on the night of the 22nd and occupied them, and on the morning of the 23rd I went on outpost duty, little dreaming of the fate that was in store for me. At that time, shells were dropping very heavily between our line of trenches and a village not far away, which was supposed to be occupied by the French. It was about 6 o'clock in the morning when I went out with my patrol, of which I was corporal in charge. There were 4 of us altogether, and we were put on outpost duty in what proved to be a very warm corner. The shelling went on all day, and we were looking forward to our relief, but it did not happen to come, and so we had to hold on. The day passed and the night came, and it was not long after darkness that we knew that a strong rush was being made on us by the enemy. They proved to be the 213th Landwehr Battalion of Prussian infantry. I saw that we were being rushed, and I knew that our chance of escape was hopeless. I thought very swiftly just then, and my thought was, we can't get away, so we may as well stick it. If we bolt, we shall be shot in the back, and we might just as well be shot in the front. It looks better. They were on us before we knew where we were, and to make matters worse, they rushed upon us from the direction of the village where we supposed the French to be. There was a scrap, short and sweet, between our outpost and the Germans, and almost in the twinkling of an eye, it seemed. 2 of my men were killed, 1 got away, and I was wounded and captured. A bullet struck me in the right arm, and I fell down, and the Germans were on me before I knew what was happening. I still had my equipment on, and to this fact and the prompt kind act of a wounded German, let us be fair and say that not all Germans are brutes. There are a few exceptions I owe my life, for as soon as I fell a Prussian rushed at me and made a drive with his bayonet. Just as he did so, a wounded German who was lying on the ground near me grabbed me and gave me a lug towards him. At this instant the bayonet jabbed at me and struck between the equipment and my wounded arm, just touching my side. The equipment and the wounded German's pull had prevented the bayonet from plunging plump into me and killing me on the spot, for the steel, driven with such force, would have gone clean through my chest. That was the sort of tonic to buck you up, and I didn't need a second prick to make me spring to my feet. I jumped up and had no sooner done so than a second bullet struck me on the wounded arm and made a fair mess of it, and I knew that this time I was properly bowled out. I had fallen down again and was lying on the ground, bleeding badly, and the next thing I knew was that I was being stripped. Everything I had on me, my equipment and my clothing, was taken away, not for the purpose of letting a doctor examine me, as one did later, but as part of a system of battlefield plunder which the Germans have organized. The very first thing the doctor said when he saw the wounds was, "Donnerwetter." I was taken to a barn and left there till morning. I had treatment, then I was moved into another barn. The Germans were decent over the business, and there was no brutality or anything of that kind. I had been taken from the second barn and was being carried across a field when the ambulance was stopped by a German doctor who was on horseback. He looked at my arm and instantly said that it would have to be amputated right away, as mortification had set in. And so, lying on the stretcher, which had been put down in the field and round which a small green tarpaulin had been rigged to keep the wind and cold out, my arm was taken off. Injections had been made in the arm, and I felt no pain during the operation, which I watched with great interest. The doctor who performed it had studied at Guy's Hospital and spoke English well. When I had been removed to a German hospital in Belgium, he saw me every morning, noon and night, and I had exactly the same food as the Germans, while the old inspector of the hospital used to give me custard and fruit now and again when he thought no one was looking, and I had cigarettes and cigars issued to me just the same as to their own men. I was in this hospital in Belgium for a fortnight, and was then moved into Germany, being sent to Münster in Westphalia with a lot of wounded Germans. It seemed as if, in leaving Belgium, I had said goodbye to civilization, in view of what happened during my imprisonment in Germany. I very soon made acquaintance with German brutality to British prisoners of war brutality and cowardice, of which I saw constant signs in my captivity. I say cowardice advisedly, because only a coward will hit and bully a man who can't hit back. On that point, however, there is some consolation. It was practically a death matter to strike a German soldier, even under great provocation, but if you were struck first, you had your remedy, and nothing pleased a British soldier more than to be struck, because that gave him his chance, and many a hard British fist got home on a fat German jaw. I shall always be thankful to know that I got 1 or 2 in on my own account, though I had only my left arm to work with. I did not, of course, strike until I had been struck first, but when I did hit out I got my own back with a lot of interest. That is getting off the track a bit, so I will go back. At Münster, I was taken into a disused circus which had been turned into a hospital for prisoners, and when I got there, the doctor examined my wound. It was all raw, but he messed about to that extent that I fainted. 2 mornings afterwards, they only dressed us every 2 mornings I was lying on a table to be dressed. The job was to be done by a young German student, a born brute, for I tell only the plain truth when I say that he deliberately cut the flesh of my only arm with his lancet and scissors. English swine, he said. He's had one arm off, and he ought to have the other off too. This was the type of fellow who was let loose on wounded, helpless British prisoners of war. Those dressings were horrible experiences, as a rule, for I was held down on the table by German orderlies, who had about as much feeling and compassion as the table itself. Let me give another illustration of the German way of treating wounded British soldiers. Just after Christmas, I was moved into an open camp at Münster, and the only covering I had was a tarpaulin, the result being that I caught cold in my wound, and on January 2nd I was moved back into another hospital. I knew nothing whatever about the regulations of the place, so that I saw nothing wrong in walking along an ordinary-looking passage. As I did this, there came towards me a man who corresponds in rank to our regimental sergeant major. I was suffering greatly from my stump, and was quite helpless. Yet this fellow seized me by the scruff of the neck and the seat of the trousers, and threw me out of the passage, and it was not till later that I learned that the passage led to the operating room, and that patients were not allowed to use it. Such a thing could not possibly happen in a British military hospital containing wounded German soldiers. It is only fair to say that the food we got in hospital was good. Though my wound was not healed, I was sent away from the hospital and back to the camp. That was bad in some ways, but it had a fine compensation, for I was attended by 2 of our own medical officers of the Royal Army Medical Corps, who were also prisoners, Captain Rose and Captain Crocker. I believe they have been exchanged now. I need not say what a joy it was to be looked after by our own splendid doctors after my experience of German brutality and callousness. Time passed slowly and very wearily, and the monotony became deadly. It was bitterly cold, and snow fell heavily and constantly till about April. We did our best to keep cheerful and fit, and were always thankful when we could get a chance of playing games. Sometimes we played football with our sentries, but they were sorry sportsmen and could not endure being beaten, even in fair football. There were some Royal Welsh Fusiliers amongst the prisoners, and 3 footballs had been sent out to them. These footballs reached the camp safely, and everybody was hugely pleased with them. We got up a match between a British team and the German sentries, and beat them 6-1. It was a straightforward, honest match, and a fair and square win, but the Germans could not stomach it, and for 3 days our smoking was stopped. No reason for the stoppage was given, but we knew well enough what the cause was, especially as the order applied only to the British prisoners of war. I will give another instance of the utter smallness of the German spirit. On the night of the day when Italy declared war on Austria, we were sitting outside our wooden huts singing our own national anthem, the Marseillaise, Rule Britannia, and lighter compositions such as High, Tiddly High Tie. In fact, anything that came to mind, just to keep things moving and cheerful. Then the news of Italy's decision came and fairly struck the Germans dumb. No reason was given for the steps they took against us, though we knew perfectly well what the cause was, but our smoking was stopped for 7 days. Some of us were locked in the lavatories for 24 hours, and for 20 days our meat was stopped, so that we were almost starved. And on top of all this, 2 Englishmen and a Belgian were sent to a punishment camp. God knows what happened to them. During all this bitter winter weather we were accommodated in wooden huts, which we had been put to build ourselves. We did not mind that in the least, because we were thankful to be employed, but it was almost impossible to keep warm in the huts owing to our scanty clothing and the small number of stoves. There were 2 stoves in each room, but we were only allowed 1 small box of coal, sometimes cooked daily, for each. Generally speaking, the British prisoners could not get near the stoves because of the foreign prisoners who crowded around them all day long, swathed in a pair of blankets. To add to the misery of the life, the bedding was horribly verminous, and we were only allowed to have 1 wash a day. That solitary wash was early in the morning, and we could not get any more, because the wash-house was closed after 7 a.m. The food was very poor, and there was not enough of it. There was plenty of soup of a sort, and, well, there might be, for it was mostly water, and there were solids of a kind for which an Englishman has no liking: chestnuts, potatoes, and horse beans, poor stuff after the splendid rations we had had as British soldiers from our own army service corps. The drinks were as bad as the solids. We had what was called coffee given to us, but there was not much difference between the coffee and the soup. As for clothing, no real attempt was made to supply us, though in so many cases we had been stripped naked when captured. When I went out of camp just after Christmas, I had only a pair of trousers and a pair of sabots, wooden shoes, and I should have fared badly if I had not been lucky enough to receive an old cycling jacket which my mother had sent out to me. The following statement will show exactly how and when we were fed each day. In the morning, at 6 o'clock, we had coffee, made from burnt rye, but nothing to eat. At 12 noon, soup, with a plentiful supply of water in it, and any one of the following ingredients: chestnuts, potatoes, horse beans, sauerkraut, acorns. At 12:30 to 1 p.m, there was an issue of bread, the loaves being about 2 in, by 6 in, by 2 in. At 3 p.m, there was coffee, as at 6 a.m, but nothing to eat, and at 6 p.m, there was soup as for dinner, but no meat, fish, or cheese. By this you will see that we had nothing to eat from 6 p.m. till noon the following day, a period of 18 hours. We had a small piece of meat 3 times a fortnight, cheese once a week, and 2 raw herrings a week. As for passing the time, it was one long dreary roll-on, night, cards, draughts, football, and causing as much trouble as we dared to the Germans, with a little singing, formed our only means of keeping sane. Nearly everybody had to work at something or other, the hours of work being 7 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. and 2 p.m. to 6 p.m. There was only one occasion when we had a little change from the bad treatment, and that was when a batch of German prisoners of war, who had been in England and exchanged, returned. They must have told how splendidly they were treated in English hospitals, which, as I know, are paradise compared with German hospitals, for we were better fed and looked after for a time. This improvement did not last long, however, and we went back to the old ways. Germans can't keep a good thing going. German cunning and lying soon made themselves evident, for under the guise of voluntary work a lot of the prisoners of war were obliged to work in mines and ironworks, and by being forced to do these things they were really helping to fight their own people. The way the trick was done was this: Germans came round and asked prisoners to volunteer to act as waiters, and a lot of us readily agreed, because any sort of employment was better than awful idleness. But the waiters soon learned that they had been shamefully deceived, for they were sent into mines and ironworks and on to farms. It was no use to protest, because it was a case of work or no food. There was so little to eat in the ordinary way that poor fellows could not face actual starvation, and so they worked unwillingly. I was asked to go and work in the fields, but I was quite incapable of doing this, and so I told the camp commandant, who put me into the office. I had had experience of orderly room work with the guards, and felt quite at home at this job, and it was interesting too, for I was in the extraordinary position of being a sort of censor. My duty was to handle letters from England for the prisoners and see that no news or cuttings from newspapers or other forbidden things got through. There were 3 of us doing this work, 2 sergeants and myself, one sergeant being in charge of the parcels. I naturally did the best I could for the prisoners. This office work was both interesting and exciting, and helped to get the time along. As for our privations generally, there was nothing for it but to make the best of them and grin and bear it. The American consul at Munster paid 2 visits to the camp while I was there, but no good came of them. Again the crafty German was prepared. It was known on each occasion that the consul was coming known 2 days before he arrived, so things were ready for him. He inspected only a few of the rooms, and the principal result of the first visit was that our dinner was 2 hours late. We made complaints, but nothing came of them. So when the consul visited us for the second time and asked if there were any complaints to make, we bluntly answered no, it's no good making them, for nothing's done. The Germans instantly published in the local paper the statement, "The English are satisfied. They have no complaints." Constant attempts were made to escape, and I fancy that some of the prisoners gave up the whole of their time to plotting and planning ways of clearing out. The chance of getting away was small because at night the camp, buildings as well as compounds, was brilliantly lighted by big electric arc lamps, and there were sentries and barbed wire entanglements everywhere. But in spite of all precautions, several Belgians and a few Englishmen and Frenchmen escaped, and we were immensely pleased when we heard that one Belgian had got away by stealing the commandant's motor car and bolting in it. I did not hear what became of him. Brutal punishments were inflicted for the most trivial offences, such as smoking in forbidden places, and a common method was to tie a prisoner to a post, with his feet deep in snow, and leave him there for 2 hours, with an armed sentry over him. The poor wretch dare not move. If he did, the brave warrior with the gun kicked him. The German is a fine hand at hitting when the other chap can't hit back. This savage cruelty had a terrible effect on some of the victims, and helped to make them the lifelong wrecks that they now are. From Munster, I was sent to Brussels for exchange. We were quartered in the Royal Academy, and naturally enough the Belgian women and children tried to give us things. When this was seen, the German wounded who were in the building were ordered to turn the hose on, and they did. It was a great laugh, though, for it took them 4 hours to fix the hose, and then it would not work properly. The authorities suddenly decided that I should not be exchanged because I was a non-commissioned officer, and I was sent to Weser on the Rhine, where I stayed 6 weeks. I had to go into hospital again because my wound would not heal it, never got a sporting chance. Ill treatment continued, and for reasons, mostly revenge, which Britishers would scorn. The chief of this hospital was an old man whose only son had been lost in a submarine that had been sunk by the British. I saw that something was wrong as soon as he appeared in the morning, and I felt that we should get it hot, though I did not know how. The old doctor had all the English prisoners sent for, and incredible as it may seem, every wound that was healed was deliberately reopened and plugged, while wounds that were not healed were probed inside, and all the newly formed flesh was destroyed. Many of us suffered terribly for a long time as a result of the visit to us of the old man who had lost his son in fair fight. My wound was finally healed on July 25th, exactly 9 months from the day on which my arm was taken off. My sole object now was to get away from the horrible country and the more horrible people, and thank God I managed to do it. The refusal to exchange me was a bitter blow, but I soon pulled up and set to work to get away. Accordingly, when I reached Wessel, I reported myself as a private, and I was reckoned as a private and put in the list for exchange. I was sent to Aix-la-Chapelle. Soon after this, I came away with other prisoners of war, and one of the most glorious moments of my life was when I set eyes again on old England. There is one strange incident that I have kept to the last. I have said that when I was shot on outpost I was stripped. My jacket must have been thrown aside, for next day a chum of mine picked it up and put it in his pack, thinking I had been killed and meaning to bring it home if he lived as a relic. During many a long day and hard fight, he carried that extra burden in his pack, no little thing to do. Then he himself was wounded and sent home. He brought my jacket with him, and now I have it, and shall always treasure it as a memento of my war day. The jacket is smothered in blood. There are about 28,000 Britishers still in Germany, suffering as I suffered, some worse. They want releasing. The only way to release them is to end the war, and the only way to end the war is the cooperation of every man and woman, old and young, rich and poor, working for one object: victory.